Um, the title page says Latinx Mental Health and Social Justice Institute, finding voices within the intersections of our identities. And it's that title, finding voices, our voices, when the intersections of our identities, that influence the focus of my presentation today on Nuestras Identidades, treasuring our Nuestras Identidades. I always like to begin my presentations with a land acknowledgement. And this to me is a way of paying respect to Indigenous peoples whose land we stand on, sit on, and populate. I chose the one from Phoenix because that is where I'm home, my home base. And it comes from the Parks and Recreation Department, acknowledging the city of Phoenix is located within the homeland of the Ohodom and Pipash peoples and their ancestors who have inhabited this landscape from time immemorial to present day. And I pay honor to those who went before us. If I were in Flagstaff, I might have a different land acknowledgement in Tucson because Arizona is home to 22 indigenous tribes. So we have the legacy of indigenous peoples throughout Arizona. So I'd like to move to a little bit about what I hope to talk about in conceptualizing, treasuring Nuestras Identidades. I'm going to focus on reflections, aprendizajes, which means learnings, y consejos, advice. And this is to say that this is a more personal, but it's also grounded in theory. It's also grounded in models that I think make a difference in the work we do as culture-centered mental health practitioners, faculty, specialists. So I'm going to talk about evolving identidades across the career lifespan and what these intersecting identities have come to mean for me in different settings and in different relationships. As Douglas said, I have spent many years being a servant leader, and those have been part of my career as well. I sometimes have a hard time separating career milestones and servant leadership. I will also focus on mentorship and legacies. And then also embodied in this are the geographies. I've had the privilege of being mobile. I didn't know growing up I was going to move so much, but these geographical perspectives and then different organizational contexts have also been part of mi identidad, or I guess I would remind us, this is meant to say to you, think about some of this and see how this applies to you as well. I always want to dedicate my presentations to the people who really were foundational to mi identidad, to mi mamá, mi papá, and mi abuela materna. These are the people I knew who shaped me, who I would say instilled in me the values of caridad, de familia, de valor, y de ganas. I mean, they really were all ejemplares of those values. So my father, Apolinar Arredondo Orozco, was born in Guanajuato, Salamanca, Guanajuato. And then my abuela, I'll start with her, mi abuela materna, Maria Estefana Zaldivar, is from Oaxaca, Santa Ana del Valle, Oaxaca, and then my mother, Eva Zaldivar, and then she married my father, was a real, again, exemplar of what it meant to, lead a family, she and my father. So I'm one of 7 children. And I think we had the benefit of being brought up, I'll speak for myself, bilingual, bicultural, and in a community of immigrants, which is really in Lorain, Ohio, which is west of Cleveland. One is always surprised and asks me what were Mexicans doing there. Well, people go to work, right? So it was La Industria. So I grew up in an immigrant city, which really shaped also my thinking, my perspective taking about cultural differences, and also introduced me to what we understand today in terms of implicit biases and microaggressions and discrimination. So all of that, I would say to you, shaped my early thinking, and probably why I went to study psychology and mental health and some of the research I have done. So that's my familia. So all of the work I've done, I've reflected on this, has been grounded in different theories that at one point were not very well known or very popular, but certainly hoy en día, we understand cultural competency as theoretical frameworks for teaching, research, practice, and just in my case for organizational consulting, which is what I do a lot of now. I've always been interested, as a girl, as a young girl, as a woman, in the role of equity, that women always needed to be at the table. And even though that might have not been part of my early experiences, I knew fundamentally that had to occur. So feminist theories around equity, and now we have more theories written by Latinas on mujerismo, mujeristas, and how we claim our voice como mujeres in our roles as family members, as professionals. I always tell people my whole idea about feminism and equity came from my father. My father was a true feminist. And there were 7 of us, as I said, 4 girls and 3 boys. Pero mi papá never said, you can't do it. In fact, he was the greatest proponent of going forward, taking the next step, which is, very classic for many immigrant parents. They want their children to do better than, and they bring us all together. They pay for our education, our Catholic school education, which candidly for me was a ticket to privilege, because as a girl I was treated very fairly because I was a good student, all those little things that matter. So, but I've continued to work in the feminist theory space, and I'll talk about that a little later too. Leadership. I learned early on that if, as a Mexican-American adolescent, high school student, that it was very rare. I didn't have any Latina teachers or administrators, etc. So, that absence, that void was notable. So in school, I learned how to take leadership roles so that there would be a Latina at the table. And I got mentorship from teachers because they, liked the fact that I would volunteer to be the editor of the yearbook, to be the president of Future Teachers of America, lo que sea. But I was very intentional. I'm going to use that word intentional probably more than once today. But I thought, to make a difference, to show that Mexicanas can be leaders, I needed to just step into it and do it. So just keep that in mind. And the work I do in certainly learning as a counselor and a psychologist about change. I mean, we talk about that at an individual level, helping people, facilitating change. But I work in organizations, so we talk a lot about change management and how organizations manage change so that it goes to the well-being of their employees, whether you're an Antioch University or if you're a Microsoft, you have to think about how change matters in organizations. And social justice principles, we didn't talk about social justice. I think, I didn't talk about it a lot until probably the last 20 years as a founding member of the Counselors for Social Justice, but it really is putting a spotlight on equity, not just at the individual interpersonal level, but at the systems level. And in many ways, the work I do as an organizational consultant in the diversity, equity, inclusion space is putting into practice social justice principles. So it's kind of an interesting intersection. So all of this grounds my thinking and my work. When I was preparing this, I worked with a doctoral student. I don't know if Sandra's on the web on this program, whether she signed in, but Sandra helps me design my slides so that they look a little bit more less boring, let me put it this way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Mi Identidad as it's moved through these different milestones in my career. And I think I always tell people, make sure you keep your resume or your CV up to date, because that is the best way of accounting for milestones, accomplishments. And then you can step back and say, oh, yeah, I did that. Oh, yes, I served on this committee. So milestones. So I'm going to talk about these different milestones, beginning with my master's degree, and then moving through where I am today in my role as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultant with organizations. All of these have influenced who I am today. So, master's to doctoral degree, a mindset for personal empowerment. Education was always an important part for my family. So we, got our library card when we were kids, and so reading was important. My father had a typewriter, and cositas así. He was a steel worker. My father was a steel worker. My mother was ran the house. But all of that was for the benefit of us, the 7 kids. So they wanted us to study first. And when I moved to Boston, I knew I wanted to continue to study. And it was my own, emancipation from I guess it was from family, I guess in a different way, kind of finding my way, but I'd always idealized moving to Boston based on books I read as a kid and maybe going to school there. So I had this, my cognition was always, doing some planning ahead. And it was about personal empowerment. So let me tell you that my early university positions were at the University of New Hampshire and Boston University. I have my master's degree from Boston College, which is a Catholic university, and Boston University. And, if you had told me I was going to go to 2 private universities, I would have said, I didn't even know. I just wanted to get a master's degree in counseling. And then my doctoral advisor found me as I was doing work as a school counselor with immigrant students. Mm-hmm. And I was at a high school right next to Boston called Brookline, and I was working with immigrant students. He said, are you thinking of doing any research with these students? I thought, well, that led to what became my dissertation research, immigrant identity development, and working with immigrants and families. So all of these early university positions, the University of New Hampshire and Boston University, took probably altogether 8 years of my life. But it was a way that I learned about transitions and change for my career. I became more curious about things. Who were the people in New Hampshire how were those people different from folks in Lorraine, where I grew up, but clearly from Boston. I lived in Boston 30 years, by the way. So I had, you know, I was always curious about who might be immigrants in those places. But these early positions, and I say this to all of you as you think about who you are, is these are settings, these are contexts to build new alliances and colleagueships. And those can stay on for your life. I still have colleagues that I met in my first position at the University of New Hampshire who are still my friends. We still know each other well. I also say early in your career, somehow distinguish yourself. You could be doing more than scholarship and networks, but also meeting people wherever you happen to be outside of your work, which is, for me, how I was able to think about doing more than being in the academy, because there was life outside of the academy, right? So, you know, meeting people who were doing volunteer work, you know, showing up at different things. Early in my career, I also did grant getting. And I didn't know what writing a grant was, but I had a mentor, Dr. Maria Risk, one of the most valiant social justice role models I've had at Boston University. She was on my dissertation committee. She asked me to be part of a grant for establishing a bilingual counseling program at Boston University. The grant was funded, so I had to leave New Hampshire and go back to my alma mater, BU, and lead the grant for 3 years. And then I would say also in these early positions, mentorship of graduate students was important to me. I worked with a lot of women in those early years, and I think my idea of mentorship still persists in my career. It's part of my identity. People will write to me and say, Doctora, can I interview for a paper I'm writing? Okay, sure, let's find the time to do it. So that's how I meet a lot of graduate students these days, since I'm not in the university formally. And I would say these early positions, try to establish specialty programs if you can. Is it something for, and I'll just say my own biases, para mujeres is for something for bilingual counseling, something for working with immigrants. So whatever this all was afforded to me in my early positions. I also learned how important it was to become, to get credentials. And even though my professor wanted us to be academics, I also knew that and was told that I had to really become licensed as a psychologist, and I did. And so I became licensed. I did a postdoc in Boston, and then I became licensed. And so I also established a private practice. So I learned a lot that you don't learn in graduate school. Let me just put it that way. These are things they don't tell you in graduate school, you know, about becoming, setting up your private practice y todo lo demás. But I've learned about myself that I am very entrepreneurial and innovative, and I like new, creative, not that I flit around, pero me gusta formar cosas. So that is what I learned when I stepped out into the real world. I left the university and I established some new colleagues and opportunities and learned about having a business, a consulting practice. So I had a private practice, and then I had a consulting practice. I needed the private practice to pay for my healthcare and all those things because, you know, you have to live. And so todo eso me salió muy bien, but it was always planning ahead. And I said, being intentional, what do I want to do? I went to a career counseling course to learn about starting a business. And then this is what I'm saying. I left higher education to set up this consultancy because, you know, culture understanding culture, understanding cultural differences has always been important to me. And when I made this transition, I have to say that I recognize, and I say this to you, that as a psychologist, as an educator, we're prepared to be change agents. We have a lot of skills. We have a lot of skills. And those skills go with us. So I took those with me. And they're still very much a part of my work and my competencies in consulting. So always being person and culture centered, those are primary for me in work. And then using communication skills to listen and influence. You know, as mental health practitioners, we learn communication skills. I mean, that's really fundamental. You know, being good listeners, seeking clarification, you know, asking questions, todo eso. And so there we are. I think we can take these skills to so many different settings and put them into practice. So, you know, throughout this time, let me just say, you know, I did have a personal life. I was married and so forth. So, and I have six stepchildren as a result of that. So none of this got lost on them. I have to tell you, you know, they continue to follow my career in their own way, and their children do too, you know, and then my nieces and nephews do también. So we have a way that I think we should remember that what we are engaged in professionally and personally is looked at. I mean, I never thought about it until the kids got older, and I thought, you know, and they would talk to me and I could talk to them about their careers. But this is, I think, an opportunity for us to also reflect on what we can pass on to children and other family members. So I made that transition. I worked as an organizational consultant full-time and also in private practice for about 13 years. And what I will say to you is, in private practice, it was almost exclusively working with women, just about exclusively working with women, because that was my niche. I wanted that. And then second is that I worked with Latinas and African-American women también. And I became like known as someone who had that rapport, and they would send me people from local universities and then some people through an EAP programs who were women of color. And so the connections, I guess I pass this on, making these connections was invaluable, and it was a gift to me to work with women y platicarles en español and do counseling in Spanish también. That was like, wow, you know, I never did that in graduate school. Well, I did sort of, but different when you're working, you know, as a professional con otras mujeres profesionales, or, you know, immigrant women también. So, I mean, it was just, this was such a gift in that space. And then also learning what it was to be a consultant. I talk about being entrepreneurial and business minded, and I'm just going to say a little bit more, a couple more sentences here. People sometimes ask me, you know, how do you become a consultant? Well, I mean, you know, let's see how long we have to talk about this. I mean, I remember when I started my consulting business, which was called Empowerment Workshops, very intentional, empowerment workshops. Me dijo un señor who used to consult to new business people. He said, it's going to take 7 years, so don't get impatient. It's going to take 7 years before you feel like you're where you need to be. I thought, wow, 7 years. But sabes qué? Okay, so I got started. I had my private practice. I'm out there fishing around, building relationships, you know, little gigs here and there, some for free, which lead to other things. And then I got my first big client. That was the Gillette company. So remember, I was in Boston. So Gillette does the shaving and all that. My first big client. I worked with them for 7 years. So this consultant was correct. That toma tiempo. So what I learned is that being patient and persisting, those are two models I have: patience and persistence. Nada te llega gratis, right? We all have, we have to be continuing to craft our spaces, saliendo, haciendo el esfuerzo, and don't be, yeah, you could be disappointed, but keep going, también. And so I had a consulting business in Boston, empowerment workshops, where I had a team of people. Patricia doesn't work alone, okay? That's something I learned many years ago. Patricia always has a team. We benefit each other. Mis colegas. I mean, this is, so inspiring to have colleagues there thinking. So we had I had a great run of it in Boston for 13 years, doing this private stuff, where I learned how to work with business people that I would have never met had I been entirely in higher education. I got to serve on nonprofit boards during this period of time. Became president of a board where I had to fire the executive director. That wasn't fun, but I'm telling you, I learned things through stepping outside of higher education that just have benefited me tremendously. And maybe I did too much sometimes, but okay, it was all, I will never trade this in for anything, to work with banks and health, hospitals, the nonprofits, the housing authority in Boston. I mean, these were all gifts for me. Okay, so I share with you all of that. And as a woman business owner, a Latina business owner, okay, I just want to say, to me, that said a lot to other people también. I just put it out there, I didn't shy away from my identity. Then I went back to higher education. And this is when opportunity knocks, and as I say, being ready. I got a call from a colleague at Arizona State University. We have a position, Patricia, would you consider it? And I didn't hang up on him. So I said, okay, that's a sign I am interested. So I said, if I don't do this now, I'll never leave Boston, is what I said. I'll never leave Boston if I don't do it now. So me fui. And I say scholarship mattered. And this is to any of you who are in the academy. I know we all have passion for different things, that are more in the social justice area. At the same time, if you have an identity as a scholar or, want to be in that academy, you have to continue your scholarship. And that made a big difference for me. Was I never I never gave up my identity as an academic, even though I was in consulting space. So when I got to Arizona State, they hired me as an associate professor with tenure, which was probably, I don't know if they would do that today, but that was remarkable. I was very honored for that recognition for my scholarship, and it actually pushed me to do more. So I actually had many more opportunities for leadership on the campus, and became, the president of the Chicano, Chicana, Latino, Latina Faculty and Staff Association. Finding a way again to keep giving back. And I then stepped into administration. People knew I had my background as a consultant. And so I became chair, but then a senior vice president for student initiatives at ASU. At the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, so I was at ASU 7 years. I went to UWM, and I was the associate vice chancellor and for academic affairs and the dean of the School of Continuing Education. I had 3 roles when I was at UWM. I was also sort of the next in charge of graduate school. Learned a lot in Milwaukee. Worked in the social health disparities area in Milwaukee because there was a tremendous need. And then I became president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in Chicago. So I was there for 4 years. So all of these, I love administration, and maybe you can tell I like to lead. I like to provide strategy, work with other people to, say what comes next. Where can we go, especially building upon multicultural competencies and consulting competencies. So whenever I talk about change, it's not change for the sake of change. It's change that's culture-centered, that's going to bring more equity, that's going to bring more voices to the table. So that was how I led in those higher education spaces. And, it wasn't always privileged. I mean, it wasn't always popular, pero too bad. Okay. Scholarship for impact. As Douglas said in his introduction, these are the areas where I'm most published. And I continue to do work in this space. I had a book in 2018 on Latinx immigrants from about how many different countries? 12 different countries. And then I just had another book accepted on counseling with immigrants and refugees. My book that was published earlier this year, co-authored on women in STEM, thriving in the chilly climate. I have my very first book was on successful diversity management initiatives, talking about change. And then I have a couple books on cultural competency development, primarily in mental health and psychology. So I guess what I say to all is I think we're all great practitioners, but we need to think about how to create more knowledge from our practice. Y por eso that's where scholarship makes a difference to me. And I feel fortunate that I've been in places where this has been important and that I've had colleagues con quien puedo escribir. So then I left higher education again. I had a couple things going with Fielding Graduate University, but then I decided to go back to diversity, equity, inclusion consultancy. And so how I describe that now is what I'm doing is really passionate to me. This is passion work for me. And I have the privilege of years of experience now in this space, now that it's become so popular, ¿verdad? It's like, wow, everybody wants somebody to help them with their diversity initiative or strategy. And what I always remind anyone who calls and asks about this work is, what's motivating you? Why does it matter to you? And I have to say, the murder of George Floyd continues to be a marker on the increase in work in the DEIB space. And people will say that to you, and they'll say, well, we started this anti-racism work, but now we don't know what to do. Where do we go next? So this is, I think, important now that we have vocabulary, we have concepts que se pueden usar that people would shy away from. And I want to help people be comfortable in examining our racial consciousness, who we are ethnically, what it means to be bilingual. And so that's why I'm passionate about this work. And I think it can make a difference. It's making an investment and helping people make that investment and influencing that investment reminding people that the work we're doing is a lifelong journey. And for me personally, I continue to learn from all of these experiences. I feel very enriched. I mean, I am working with, I have probably 10 different projects, and I have, again, a team of consultants. If you check out my webpage, arredondoadvisorygroup.com, you will see the wonderful people that I am privileged to call my colegas, all very accomplished, all very committed to leadership and change, and people I can depend upon to do this important work in organizational consulting and executive coaching. I just want to take a minute about executive coaching. As I said before, I was prepared as a counselor, school counselor, mental health counselor, and a counseling psychologist. And I leveraged that to go into organizational consulting and executive coaching. Well, executive coaching is different than counseling, but there's a lot of the same skills you will use in executive coaching. And there I'm working with senior administrators at universities or in the private sector, primarily BIPOC people, primarily people of color. And there are often the challenges of being an administrator or a leader in an organization where you're the first one that's ever been in that role. And as I tell some of my the people I coach, I say, people have never reported to a person of color. They've never reported to a woman. So this is very confusing for them. So, don't personalize some of the, interactions. I said, just, see how we can facilitate their learning. But it's true. I mean, there's so many challenges, and people then drop out because, it's too hard. So I'm happy when universities pay for their administrators to participate in this work. Watching the time. So just the last couple of slides. Servant leadership across the lifespan. Douglas mentioned some of the roles I've had. And just as I learned when I was in high school that if I wanted to make sure there was a Latina voice at the table, I needed to do the work. I needed to step in. I needed to volunteer. I didn't need to ask permission. I needed to volunteer. There's a difference between volunteering and asking for permission. So I don't ask for permission very often. But you can see that in all of these roles, and there's just a ton of others, that these are primarily in the academic space. I've been, not all of them. I was the first Latina president of the American Counseling Association, which is a big deal. The first Latina president, okay? And now we have the first Latino president who will become president next year, Dr. Adil Torres Rivera from Wichita State University. So, you just have to do it. When people I said, I'm not really interested in being president, but I know what it represents. So just go do it. And I'm founding president of the National Latinx Psychological Association. We're celebrating 20 years next week in Denver. And then I've been the chair of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Ed, and president of a division of 40 APA and blah, blah, blah. So one of my passion organizations right now is Gay Sons and Mothers, which was started by a friend of mine in Boston. And I also encourage you to visit their website because it's just powerful. The interviews that Rick, the director, has had with gay sons and their mothers. And today on the Arredondo Advisory Group website, we just came out with a new blog on Coming Out Month. And so coming out in the workplace. And I just tell you, we try to really pass on knowledge that we think will be important. Become is a social justice organization founded by one of my former doctoral students in Chicago. and I'm on their board. And then I'm also a trustee for the Association of Counseling, Sexology, and Sexual Wellness, which is a new division within ACA. And, you know, people ask me, will you be a trustee? Okay, all right. This is a former student, so, you know, you can't say no. I can't say no, let me put it that way. So I think I want to wind down by saying, just remember that we are a composite of different dimensions of personal identity. And you could all get this out of a textbook if you've taken multicultural counseling. And I just want to footnote that this model, which I developed with a colleague in 1992, is based on my work with immigrants. And that I got very frustrated because immigrants were always saying, oh, that's an immigrant. And it's like they depersonalize them. They don't have an age, they don't have a gender, they're just an immigrant. So this was my way of saying they're individuals are a composite of different dimensions of identity. So this could be a whole other topic. But you can tell how identity means a lot to me. I've just never shied away from it. So what are some of my lessons learned as we segue into a few questions, please? Well, I would say always remember and value your roots, your heritage. I mean, for me, it's been muy importante. I just treasure my heritage. Integrity, patience, and collectivism. Lo que hago yo, yeah, I benefit all the time, but I really think about the collective benefit. Change comes through intentionality. See, hay que cambiar algo, hay que cambiarlo, but, you know, plan it, anticipate. Women's instincts matter. You know, we've oftentimes people said, oh, you know, it's a woman's instinct. Well, guess what? It matters. There's a book that was published in '86, Women's Ways of Knowing. Women's Ways of Knowing is like, yes, that's what I say. And then always look for role models. I think there are so many wonderful role models. When I was a kid, people would say, who's a role model? Well, you know, I was, you know, 8 or 10 years old, and I thought, well, you know, I looked around, and I'd have to say it was my parents, because there was no one on television who was a role model, right, at the time, or, you know, I didn't know any educators, so it was my family. I think they're the best role models, my parents and my abuela. So this is a woman who's a role model for me. La mera mera Dolores Huerta. And I use this quote all the time. Every moment is an organizing moment, every person a potential activist, and every minute a chance to change the world. ¿Verdad? Yes, go Dolores. She's just amazing. 92 years old, amazing. Okay, mi buena gente. These are a few references. If you're going to give the slides out, this is you know, just a few references here. This is one of my favorite articles here, Mujeres Latinas, Santas y Marquesas, that I wrote and I have published in 2003 in the journal. You can look it up. It's kind of, what I liked about it is really about mujeres' strengths in a historical sense. So I would say to you, gracias, and un poquito de plática ahora. Okay, let's get our plática going. I'm going to stop sharing.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Arredondo. We have about 7 minutes or so for questions, so please share your questions in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you and definitely have, you know, participate. If you have any questions for Dr. Arredondo.
I like all the little hearts. I like the little corazones going across the screen. Gracias.
And Dr. Rasha also mentioned in the chat, she's like, as a kid, my role model was Paula Abdul. I loved her.
Yes, okay. Mm-hmm. Me too. Yes, role models are so important. We often forget that the role models in our immediate life of those, you know, we oftentimes externalize, you know, oh, that professor, that, although I have to say a role model, the professor was a role model. He happened to be a Cuban, the only Latino professor I had when I was in undergraduate school. So that shaped me too.
Yeah, it's amazing. We do have one question in the chat
Sure.
here. It's staying true to our roots is always the goal. However, paths in climbing the leadership ladder may blur those lines at times. What helped you stay true to yourself as you took on all those different opportunities? What are some tips for doing this?
And was the first part of the question that what parents did she say was it?
Oh no, like what helped you stay true to yourself
Yeah.
as you took on the different opportunities?
Oh, okay. Stay true to myself because I believe that those opportunities were deeply connected to my values, that that I could feel myself in those spaces. You know, if I volunteered for a women's shelter, for example, I mean, it was about work in a space that was often marginalized. I guess a lot of the work I've done has been in marginalized spaces when I think about it. And so I stay true to myself. I mean, there's sort of a reflexive dynamic going on when I do this work. And as I said, I bring other people along. So I did this big project at Arizona State at a community where it was a Habitat for Humanity community for immigrants, primarily Mexican Americans. And so the president at ASU said to me, Patricia, you like, working with immigrants, why don't you go check it out? Well, it became a thesis and dissertation for a number of my graduate students. There were 10 of us at a number of times working there, doing, interviews, learning, we formalized it, they formalized it into their research. But, I often say, go where the people are. And, just the real data is in the voices of people. And that's continues to empower me. And that's why even in the work I do as a consultant, we always do focus groups to hear from the people in organizations. So what matters to you? What, creates a sense of inclusion, exclusion? How can this be a better organization for all employees, regardless of their backgrounds? Cosas así, so those voices are powerful. Gracias. I hope that answered. Gracias.
And it sounds like also like staying open to opportunities that come your way and really being kind of careful about choosing what, what's coming your way, what may be on your path and your career goals.
También. And, listening to other people, I mean, being curious, I say, is so important. If you are I've always told students, join professional associations. You need to have your identity validated as a professional. And yes, many individuals want to have a private practice because they, have the credentials, but you still need to be in community where your identity is validated. And that's one piece of advice I continue to pass on is because it can get lonely, and so, and oftentimes our families don't understand what our work, going to graduate school, when I left my first university job, my father was a little bit concerned. He had been in the steel mill for 50 years, right? So, here I am, moving away from a job, and he didn't quite understand the consulting thing, but when he got it, and he was my biggest fan, So I think those are sometimes the losses, if you're a first generation, whatever, is that your familia doesn't quite understand it. Oh, you're still in school, cosas así, I think many of us have heard that. But, that's why being in community with other graduate students or other professionals will, keep the momentum and the purpose going. So.
Claro que sí, that's amazing. And it's definitely true. Thank you so much. Such inspirational talk and wonderful information. And I think I can speak for most people here and just say thank you so much for everything. I did want to just couple of housekeeping things to make sure people fill out the evaluation and that are just posted there. Make sure you sign out and join us for the closing ceremony in about 5 minutes. I think Dr. Dietz is stepping in.
I just want to say thank you so much. I can't leave without saying thank you. That's fantastic to see your journey and getting to know you a little bit better and just hear everything that you have gone through. I know there is a lot more to say on that. But thank you for sharing that and for remaining true to yourself as somebody was asking. I think that's really important. And I know we know how hard it is. That's easier to say than done. So thank you for that.